Next up, I want to introduce to the stage a very brilliant and powerful woman. One of the reasons many of our student groups, particularly groups on campuses that support Palestinian rights, professors, activists, and speakers like ourselves, feel really bold, because I'm like, when we go down, Dima's going to come figure out how to represent us. So please welcome to the stage Dima Khalidi, who's the co-founder and director of Palestine Legal. She is a brilliant attorney. She used to work at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and every day she wakes up to defend our rights to stand up in these college campuses and speak truth to power in solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Good evening. It really is amazing to be here, and damn, look at my co-panelists over there. This is such a courageous and committed, and they are just unwavering justice warriors, and it is so humbling to be among them and among all of you today. Thank you so much, MEF, SUT, for making this happen again. And obviously, people care about this. This auditorium is full. There is energy, and hopefully we'll go home organized, more organized and with better plans. What I want to do is give a little bit of background to this conversation to show not only how widespread the attacks on the Palestine movement are, but also to show how they fit into a wider story of growing attacks on all of our rights to organize and to dissent. I just want to start with a story of a recent incident that we at Palestine Legal have been dealing with. A young Palestinian-American student at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, down in southern Illinois, recently gave a presentation as part of her role as a multicultural advocate in a program that was intended to, give diverse perspectives about social justice issues. And her presentation was about Palestine, and specifically about Gaza's Great March of Return. And it highlighted 70 years of Palestinian resistance. So it gave a history of the Palestinian struggle, of human rights abuses against Palestinians. It very carefully defined what anti-Semitism was, what anti-Zionism was. It defined all of the terms that she was using, including apartheid. And it painted a picture of what life was like for Palestinians in Gaza. A few housing staff at the university saw this, and within days there was school-wide upheaval. A resident assistant filed a complaint about the presentation, and the chancellor, this might sound familiar, sent a school-wide email that condemned the presentation as anti-Semitic. Now, a couple days earlier, swastikas had been found in dorms. So the email, in one line, condemned those and said that the school was investigating it. And in several paragraphs after that, went on and on about this presentation and how it offended people and how the university didn't tolerate anti-Semitism and all of the remedies that it would take in response. Trainings, investigations, rethinking this whole multicultural advocate program. Pro-Israel groups complained about it. A right group called Stand With Us said that the swastikas found on campus, along with several other attacks on Jewish symbols like mezuzahs on doors, paled in comparison to the presentation. The swastikas paled in comparison to a Palestinian American student's presentation about her people's oppression. And Stand With Us, along with other pro-Israel groups, encouraged the university to adopt this redefinition of anti-Semitism that Omar referenced, basically labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. Now, this is not criminalization, but it is the precursor. This kind of condemnation by public officials as something that's inherently morally reprehensible or bad is what's needed in order for the next step of criminalization to happen, of punishment, of censorship. This is the kind of attack we see every day at Palestine Legal, of course. It's the targeting of Palestinians and their allies who are speaking the truth about what's happening on the ground, what has happened to them and their families, about Palestinians' lived realities of military occupation and second-class citizenship and apartheid-like conditions, about their dispossession, about being strangers in their own land and being criminalized for resisting it. We're distracted from even talking about these issues, about these realities and the truths that we know as Palestinians. Because every time we speak up, we have to respond to these accusations that our real motivation is that we're anti-Jewish. Not that we care about Palestinians or their rights, or anybody else's, for that matter. And that's the point. It's to silence our ability to talk for ourselves, to tell our own stories. We're distracted, we're intimidated, we're made examples of. We're exhausted, our resources are exhausted, and we have to worry more about what we say, about how what we say affects our oppressors than about what's happening in Palestine. I want to give a little bit of context about why this is happening and how. These attacks on the Palestinian rights movement are not happening in a vacuum, and I think the intro gave a little picture of this already. But these are part of a concerted, widespread effort to undermine and destroy this movement. Since 2014, Palestine Legal has responded to about 1,500 incidents of suppression. And that's just a fraction of what many of you have probably experienced when you speak out. These incidents have included lawsuits, like against the American Studies Association for passing a resolution endorsing an academic boycott, like against Professor Rabab Abdelhadi, who, because of her strong voice and her scholarship on Palestine, has been relentlessly attacked. And she went through years defending a lawsuit. These kinds of things drain us. They use our resources, and they distract us from the real work. They've included professors getting fired for, like Stephen Salaita did at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, for tweeting about the massacre of kids in Gaza in 2014. They include students being investigated and punished for protesting and doing, mock checkpoints on their campuses to show their peers what it's like to live under a military occupation. They've included public institutions like libraries and universities and museums canceling events because there were complaints that it would be too biased or too offensive. And they've included widespread surveillance of activists, like Omar mentioned. Not only does Canary Mission profile thousands of students and professors, but we have, at the recent NSJP conference, National Students for Justice in Palestine, there were people taking pictures of everybody going in and out and posting on the internet horrible things about them and resulting in more attacks and death threats and rape threats. This is what it means to speak out for Palestinian rights today. You are vulnerable to this kind of relentless harassment, and it's often anonymous. And we see, of course, FBI agents knocking on doors and asking people about their activism. And of course, on top of all of these various tactics that are being used, we have a wide-ranging legislative assault happening. 27 states now have laws that punish in one way or another boycotts for Palestinian rights. Of course, we know Massachusetts legislators are trying for the third time to introduce an anti-boycott bill. And we're also expecting a new wave of legislation that tries to redefine anti-Semitism for use in investigations of campus activists that allege anti-Semitic discrimination. All of this legislation has real consequences for people. Anti-boycott laws have resulted in the loss of jobs and opportunities for people like Bahia Amawi, the Palestinian-American speech pathologist in Texas, who, when she went to sign a contract for maybe the 9th year, all of a sudden she saw a certification. She had to sign something that said, I won't boycott Israel. I don't and I won't boycott Israel, in order to have this job. And she refused. And she sued, and she's winning, and that's fantastic. We're seeing courts striking down these laws slowly, but these battles take forever, and we cannot rely on the courts. And beyond these real consequences, the chilling effect is enormous. And that's what's really the intent that is really behind the laws. It's to use them to shut us up, to confuse us. Is this criminal? Am I allowed to boycott? People come to us with these questions every day. What does it mean that our legislators are saying that boycotts are this and boycotts are that? So it's important to understand that all of these efforts are being encouraged, they're being facilitated, they're being funded with tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars, not just by Israel, but by dozens of Israel advocacy groups here. And we have armies ready to attack anyone who utters the word Palestine or BDS. The other context that's important is that this is a global problem. And I think Omar mentioned that, the kind of censorship we're seeing in Germany after its parliament passed a resolution saying that BDS is anti-Semitic. Artists are being denied prizes. Talib Kweli was disinvited from a music festival because he refused to renounce BDS. In France, activists are being criminally prosecuted for engaging in BDS campaigns. What's happening in France and Germany and other countries in Europe is really the logical and the intended conclusion of what Israel and its allies are working towards here as well. Government sanctions censorship and punishment of Palestinian rights advocacy. We have to understand that that is the aim. They don't want us to talk. They don't want us to organize. They don't want us to expose what's happening. And the other piece of context that is really critical is that we're not just talking about anti-boycott laws. We're talking about an enormous attack on our right to dissent across the board. We've seen 16 states that have enacted anti-protest legislation. Many of these laws are imposing actual criminal penalties and fines on protesters. And these movements that are being attacked are, indigenous rights movements, climate justice movements, racial justice movements. These include so-called critical infrastructure bills that criminalize indigenous and environmental activists' resistance to pipelines and the protection of water and indigenous land and resources, so-called free speech laws that are weaponizing the First Amendment to protect far-right speakers from student protests on campuses. Not exactly what I think the First Amendment was intended to do, which was to protect us from the government's censorship, not from our own protests. And of course, we see the FBI labeling the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black lives, Black identity extremists. So in this era with these right-wing agendas as ascendant, our rights to dissent, to protest, to collectively rise up against all of these injustices are being sacrificed to protect the status quo of white supremacy and corporate power. This is what we're up against. This attack is also not happening outside of history, and that's really important to remember as well. In our history, it's a matter of course that dissenters and popular or unpopular social justice movements have been targeted by the government. From communists in the 40s and 50s with McCarthyite witch hunts, to the civil rights and Black power movements of the 60s and 70s and the anti-war movement, people calling for revolutionary, radical change have been mercilessly attacked, assassinated, surveilled, infiltrated, as was the American Indian movement and the Chicano power movement. This is not an anomaly. Let's be clear. The difference with the Palestinian rights movement here is that it's not the US government that's been leading the crusade. It's been private pro-Israel groups pressuring the US government, and they've failed a lot, they actually have. But with an administration now that is so fundamentally anti-Palestinian, with the staunchest Zionists in the highest of positions, and a Christian Zionist base with enormous influence, we're seeing the state increasingly take up this suppression, heeding the calls through legislation, through surveillance, through investigations into Palestine advocacy. And it's part and parcel of a widespread attack on the left, where the real and the deadly anti-Semitism of the far-right white nationalist movements is given a pass. And the human rights advocacy of the left is posited as the biggest threat to Jewish communities. This is the narrative that we're hearing. The swastikas pale in comparison to an educational presentation about Palestine. I want to also be clear that all of this is happening because we are winning. We're winning. And we're winning because we're organizing at the grassroots, and we're organizing across movements. And the youth are leading the way, SJP. Yes. And as Omar said, the Palestinian call for BDS has been taken up by churches and unions and student governments and athletes and authors and singers. Now, as an example, the University of Illinois students, they weren't having it. They weren't having the mass mail. They weren't having this complete conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. They weren't having the university ignoring the real racism happening on campuses. And they've been organizing for weeks. SJP made a list of demands calling for the chancellor to apologize, to issue a new statement clearly distinguishing between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, to institute trainings not just about anti-Semitism, but about anti-Black racism and queerphobia and Islamophobia, as well as anti-Semitism. and 15 other student groups, from the Black United Front to Jewish Voice for Peace to environmental justice groups to Latinx groups to socialist and Arab and Muslim groups, signed on to these demands. And hundreds of students attended teach-ins and protests, and they threatened to do a sit-in at the chancellor's office. And then they got a resolution passed in the student government, endorsing their demands and demanding that the university issue an apology. This is the kind of organizing that it takes. This shows how students are leading the way with their unapologetic and their bold demands. And they're able to do this because they've been organizing for years with other students on other social justice issues, educating and mobilizing each other. This didn't happen overnight. These students have been at college learning and organizing. That's what it's for. And it's clear that this intersectional work and the solidarity that has grown between movements is the biggest threat. Israeli officials have said point blank that the major problem with Israel is the young generation of the Black community. Clearly, the immense backlash that Black intellectuals and activists who speak out for Palestinian rights, from Mark Lamont Hill to Angela Davis to Michelle Alexander, it's a result of how much weight such solidarity holds, how much it clarifies the answer if you believe in equality and justice and human dignity for all. The truth is that there's no BDS or terrorist boogeyman whose demise will bring the rest of the movement crashing down. This is a decentralized, a grassroots, and intersectional movement that understands that Palestinian freedom is bound up with the freedom of oppressed and marginalized people everywhere. This is why it's possible for Massachusetts to again defeat this anti-boycott legislation. A 100 grassroots activist groups joined the last 2 times and defeated it. And we can win these fights, even in these forums where we don't historically have power. The last point I want to make is that we are winning, but as Shaun alluded to, we're outnumbered and we're definitely out-resourced. And perhaps we need better plans as well. And things are really likely to get worse for all of us. So it's imperative that we continue to organize, to speak out, to defy these odds. Organizations like ours, PalLegal, is here to help and to tackle the legal threats against this movement, to protect folks from the attacks. But in order for us to see not only Palestinian freedom, but also Black and brown freedom and indigenous freedom and environmental justice, etc., we have to have each other's backs. We have to lift each other up. We have to show up. Ultimately, we have protection in our numbers. 1,600 sold-out crowd, that's a big number. We have protection in our principled and unwavering commitment to freedom and justice and equality for everyone without exception. We have strength in our clear rejection of racism, xenophobia, transphobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the white supremacy that is fueled by all of this hatred. So if we have all in this room, if we all stand firm and stay loud and show our collective power, we can and we will win. Thank you.